So this is the remote observing room. This is where I spend 5 nights on every shift that I have, sitting here observing whatever the astronomers ask us to observe. So the screens over here on the far side, that's what we're using to look at what's going on up the summit. So we have webcams both inside the telescope and outside the telescope so that we can look and see if there are any issues since we can't be up there in person. The outside ones are very helpful when we get a lot of snow or ice so that we know whether or not we can open during the night. It's also the one that we use to open up the telescope, open up the mirror covers, and make sure all the systems are ready to go for the night. So this next screen here is what we use to look both up at the summit and in the Waimea cameras as well, so we can monitor headquarters just as much as the summit. We also use it so we can communicate with observers at the other observatory, so we are on the same base of what conditions are. In case something rolls in, we can let each other know quickly. This next screen is what we use to actually run our programs through the night. So we have images coming up here, and we can actually see all the commands that are being sent to the telescope through this screen. We can also send each of the individual programs based on the conditions and what we think is right. The screen over here is the basis of our telescope commands. So everything that's being sent to the telescope goes through this screen. So these screens are what we use to monitor conditions even more closely. So we have like the satellite image, so we know if there are any clouds coming in, where they're coming from, about how long they're going to stay. It can give us an idea whether or not we want to close up the telescope. We also have these cloud cameras up here, which take long exposure images of the night sky, so I can see clearly the movement of the clouds up at the summit. We also have these other 2 monitors, which are looking at how thick the clouds are, so how much they're washing out the stars we're looking at, and also how much the atmosphere is moving above us. So this monitor is telling us about the conditions of the telescope. So we can see where the telescope is pointed, you can see where the target is, you can see where the dome is pointing in relation to the telescope. So we want to make sure that the dome and telescope are always aligned so we get that starlight. And we can also see the weather conditions, so we know if the weather is getting worse, if it's okay, if maybe we want to point into the wind or not because we'll get better seeing values, or there will be less atmospheric interference because of the wind going into the dome instead. This picture behind me was actually an image taken by us using our instrument MegaCam. It's an image of the Rosette Nebula. This big red button here is our emergency stop. Since we're down here in Waimea, if something happens up at the summit of Mauna Kea, we need to have an emergency stop so that all systems immediately shut off if something were to happen. We don't often push this button because if we do, the shutter will be open, the dome will be in the same spot, and we won't be able to move it until somebody goes up to the summit to turn all those systems back on again. A remote observer takes data that's requested by astronomers, and we sit down in Waimea while we're controlling the telescope at the top of Mauna Kea. The most interesting thing I've ever observed was Oumuamua, which is the first interstellar comet that came through our solar system that we've ever seen. Now there are more of them out there, but this one was special because it was the first. And we had an observation that came over from Maui, so they observed it first. And then they sent it back to us for a reobservation. So I gotta be that person with the reobservation. And then in all the science magazines, one of the images that was in there was actually taken by me. So I'm pretty proud of that one. That's a great question. So observing the universe through the atmosphere can be tricky at times because the atmosphere is always moving. So when you're looking at a star and it's twinkling, that's because there's a lot of atmosphere that's moving in between us and the light coming from that star. To get around that, we try to observe at higher places. So on Mauna Kea, it's a great location because there's less atmosphere that light has to go through to get to us. A meteor shower through a large telescope looks like big streaks going through the night sky. So it actually does interfere with our images sometimes. We don't see the bright flashes that you would if you're just sitting there looking up at the night sky. But since we have long exposure times, what happens is we'll get these very long streaks from either shooting stars or satellites going through. Well, we don't want sunlight getting on the mirror because the mirror is so powerful that light reflecting off the sun is going to be so concentrated. So anywhere it reflects off of onto is going to get very hot, it might melt, it might catch on fire, and we really don't want our observatory catching on fire. So we avoid opening the telescope during the day if at all possible. So the bright moon is the bane of the observer's existence. What I mean by that is a bright moon means we can see less stars in the sky. We actually have to plan the programs we're observing around the moon so that the ones that need the very dark skies and the deep fields can be observed when it's dark and there's a new moon instead of full moon. It depends what we're observing, whether or not we can observe through clouds. So if we're looking at a very bright star and doing, say, spectroscopy on it, yes, we can get some good data out of that. But it does depend on how thick the clouds are. When you're doing imaging, you can't have as many clouds as you can with spectroscopy. So it's a little bit harder. So somebody should become a remote observer because you're on the front lines of astronomy. You gotta sit there every night taking data that's going to be used to change the way we look at the universe. And that's what I think is the best part of being a remote observer. If you want to be a remote observer, you should definitely study about some science and technology. So understanding how a telescope works is really important. And being able to understand the science that's going on is also very helpful because that way you can do better when you're observing at night. So definitely looking into that science technology, which is always fun. Those were my favorite subjects when I was in high school and college. There are tons of programs we have here on the Big Island to encourage people to study in fields of science and technology. So we have days like Astro Day, we have the Waimea Solar System Walk, Onizuka Day in Hilo. There are all kinds of different programs that you can go to and learn about different sciences that you might become interested in later on. And there are also tons of internships as well, such as Mauna Kea Scholars, and the Akamai internship for college students as well. I do lots of other things at CFHT. Mainly when I'm not observing, I will be working on social media while at home currently. And if I'm not working on social media, I'm preparing for my next run as an observer. So I'm looking at the programs, I'm understanding what they're talking about and the constraints they need so that I get better data when I do come in for my night shift. My typical shift that I have when observing is that I'm on for 5 nights of observing, and then I'm off for about 15 nights or so. And I'll come in those 5 nights and observe from about hour before sunset to an hour after sunrise. So being awake all night and then going back to a day schedule can be tricky for some people. So you definitely have to gauge it so that you stagger how late you're staying up and then stagger how late you're going to bed on either side of your shift. Being here alone at night is a little weird at first, but then again, you can play your music loud and you kind of get time to yourself, so it's kind of nice for me. The pandemic has affected my job a little bit in that when I'm sitting down here in Waimea, I see even fewer people than I would on a normal shift. So there's no one in the office for me to really say hello to when I come in the afternoons or when I leave in the morning. But otherwise, I'm still observing all night, most nights, without really interactions with most people. What I find interesting about the universe is that it's so big. We can't even comprehend how big the universe is. So every time I'm looking out at a galaxy or a nebula, and it's so far away, you can even imagine that there are billions and trillions of galaxies and nebulas just like this spread across the entire universe that we're never going to be able to get to, but at least we can study the light coming from them, and that's what we do in astronomy. I have never seen aliens. I have seen some unidentified objects that may have been later identified as something else, such as a satellite going past, or maybe a rocket fuel booster that came through the atmosphere and split up. But I've never seen any aliens. I do have a hobby. One of my favorite things to do in my free time is actually baking. I like to make as extravagant kinds of cakes as I can and decorate them so, they're Instagram worthy.